Laudato exaudibus, ecclesia.
Hey everyone, this is Braden from the Catechumen. Today we're interviewing Steve Weidenkopf, the author of a number of Catholic Answers books, but we are interviewing him about his newest book, Canceled, 12 Catholic Heroes That History Turned Into Villains. How are you doing today, Steve?
I'm doing great, Braden. Thanks for having me on the show.
I am so excited to get into this book. I have a number of your books, and so I'm very interested in hearing about what began your interest in writing about history, or just interest in history in general.
Yeah, sure. A great question. I mean, many years ago, when I was a undergrad at Syracuse University, I won't say when I graduated because that will really put my age out there. But many years ago now, I took I went to Syracuse for an international relations degree, and part of that program was different ways you could fulfill some of the core curriculum, liberal arts curriculum. And one was this specific category, if you will, of courses on the medieval and Renaissance period. And so I took that on kind of whim. I had some interest in history as a kid growing up. My dad was in the Air Force. I was an Air Force brat. Mostly it was military history growing up, but I thought, well, this is neat. I'll take this. And, really just ballooned that whole series of courses, which were history courses, literature courses, fine arts classes as well, about the medieval and Renaissance period, really kind of put that history bug into high gear in my life, if you will. And so really enjoyed all those classes and learning about these specific, periods of time from, roughly around the 10th century all the way up until about the 15th, 16th century was really the time period that we covered. And it was great. I just loved it. And afterwards, later on in life, I pursued a master's degree in theology and took some additional courses of church history there. And then when the school that I went to, the Christendom, it used to be called the Notre Dame Institute. Then it became the Notre Dame Graduate School of Christendom College. Now it's kind of the Graduate School of Christendom College. But we were looking for a church history, somebody to teach church history classes there about 20 years ago now. And I had just recently published a church history program called EPIC through Ascension Press, which is a parish-based program that goes through an adult faith formation program on church history. And so, I was one of my professors recommended that I teach the church history classes at the graduate school, and the dean agreed. And so 20 years later, I'm still there teaching courses. So that's kind of how that went about.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's awesome. So in this book, you kind of make the connection in the introduction about why studying history as Catholics is so important. I mean, first of all, our church we profess that our church is the church that has existed throughout all the ages. For the past 2,000 years, we are the church that Jesus Christ established. And that's why it's one of the reasons why it's so important to know our history, to know when, Protestants or atheists or people of other religions might bring up certain aspects of our history in objecting against our faith. And so I'm wondering what inspired you to write this book specifically? Because I know you have other history books kind of going through similar periods, similar figures. What about this topic specifically interested you?
Yeah, sure. As you point out, I've written a number of different books on church history and from a Catholic perspective. And so my general kind of approach to writing history and to teaching history is that from our perspective, from a Catholic perspective, is that we want to learn from the men and women who have come before us in faith, right? That's one of the primary reasons in which to learn church history, is that we can learn from the times in which the people before us have lived, right? Both saints and non-saints, right? Just average, ordinary Catholics. How did they handle certain periods of time in their life, right? Either external crises, political crises, or internal crises in the church, if you will. How did they deal with it, and who were these people, right? So that we can learn from them and become better Catholics, better Christians, and help influence our world in a positive way, frankly. So that's kind of the general theme of all of my books, is what I try to do. And one of the biggest things I found in more modern discussions of history and a misunderstanding that people have about many Catholic historical events and figures, is a lack of understanding the context in which these events occurred, or in which the people who participated in these events lived. And so, it's not dissimilar from, I guess, maybe scripture commentary or scripture
Right.
discussions that people might have, where people take scripture out of context. It's the same thing with history, right? People take historical people out of context, out of their historical context. They take these events out of context, and then they use it to justify whatever kind of agenda they're driving or point they're trying to make, right? And so with this particular book, I know that Many of these people in the book that I cover have been maligned or canceled in history recently, especially in the modern world, whether it's from an Enlightenment perspective or a secular perspective or a Protestant perspective. And so I wanted to try to illustrate from a Catholic perspective who these people were, why they lived, and not necessarily to justify their actions, right, completely, but to explain what they did and why they did it. And even in some cases, to present perhaps a much more different light than what we normally receive when we attend a church history class, or a church history class, rather. And these figures are talked about, right? Perhaps the biggest one that comes to mind, and maybe we'll get into more detail about it in a minute, but is the cover girl, if you will, Marie Antoinette on the cover of the book, and she along with others in the book that I cover from a religious and a non-religious perspective in history are presented in very inauthentic ways to who they actually were, and many historians, especially secular historians and even Catholic or Christian historians, will downplay the faith life aspect of many of the people that I cover in the book, and I think it's important for us to focus on that and to learn about that from these people, right?
Right.
So that's kind of why I wrote the book. Yeah.
So would it be fair to say that kind of the popular understanding of these figures throughout history either judges them by unfair standards, because they live in different times and different places and different cultures, or maybe they're just entirely misrepresented, like they didn't actually do what many people thought that they did?
Yeah, I think it's a both and, right? That's definitely true for most of the people in the book, that there's some factual inaccuracies in the kind of modern narrative that we believe about these people. But also, there's an unfair standards placed on people in the past from people in the modern world, right? So I talk about a little bit in the book, but there's this kind of constant, or this modern day notion known as presentism, right, within historical topics. And presentism is basically judging the past from a supposed position of superiority in our modern world, right? Many modern people like to look back. I mean, I shouldn't say, I'm generalizing here, but many people in the modern world like to look back on history or historical actors and judge them from our own day and age, right? And so it's not to say that anything they might have done immoral. Morality doesn't change throughout the ages, I think, right? But just from our position of perspective, we think, oh, these people were so dumb or superstitious or zealous or whatever, and we don't understand the times in which they lived, which then obviously influenced how they acted and behaved, just as it happens for us today in the modern world. So.
For sure. What would you say to someone who kind of looks at this book and is like, oh, well, this kind of goes against the popular narrative that I've been, taught my entire life. It's kind of like a revisionist history, and we all know about those revisionist historians. What would you say to that criticism?
Yeah, well, I would say a couple of things. I would say, sure, in a certain sense, it depends on how you use the term, but yes, in a certain sense, it is a revisionist history of sort. I'm trying to present these people from a different light than the modern, historical narrative and the popular historical narrative in many ways, which is false. So, I would say, number one, the book is heavily researched, and I footnoted in the back. So if you have any questions of anything that I'm saying or writing about, you can definitely do the research yourself, look at the books and look at where I got that research from. Make your own decisions, if you will. And I'm not necessarily saying this is the only way in which to view these people necessarily, but I'm saying that there are some things that we need to correct in the historical record that are factually inaccurate. But then also from another perspective is, here's a Catholic perspective on which to view these people. And history is, there are perspectives in history. And I think it's an honest historian, will tell you what his perspective is up front. That doesn't mean that he's not objective. He or she's not objective. Doesn't mean that they, will cherry pick sources or will, bend the sources to their will. Although that sadly does happen. But it's you're going to present it from an objective, whether that's a faith perspective or a non-faith based perspective. You still have a perspective as a historian. And that's another kind of the modern myths about history in general, is that since the 19th century, at least, history has been presented as this objective kind of science. And there's certain aspects to that in terms of, looking at documents and manuscripts and comparing them and this and that there's some kind of textual criticism that's objective that needs to be utilized, obviously, in the historical sciences. But, history is still very much a product of the individual who's writing it. And that individual always has a perspective. And so you have to keep that in mind.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it makes sense that the historian will see some pieces of evidence as more important, or maybe even taking priority over others, right? Or framing as a framework for putting others in perspective. And by no means of the imagination are you like, oh, look at me. I've looked into these sources and no one agrees with me. I'm the only person to have thought of this before, because especially one of the topics that really interests me is the Inquisition, especially specifically the Spanish Inquisition, and that like the popular scholarly perspective has shifted over the years, and the popular view among lay people, so to say, or non-historians, so to say, doesn't always match up with what the most updated scholarship has revealed. And so it seems like it's almost like telling people that telling people what the scholarly views are now, as preferring that over the popular misinformation.
Yeah, absolutely. That's 100% true. I mean, the Inquisition is definitely an area where that is true. And so is the Crusades, right? So I cover the Templars in this particular book. Yeah. But in a whole different book that I wrote many years ago now called The Glory of the Crusades, that's exactly what that book is. It's taking the scholarship that exists in academia currently and trying to present it to a wider popular audience. Because as you point out, what many people in the popular world, right, understand about the Crusades is a false notion and a false narrative about the Crusade movement, and no respectable historian, right, medievalist or Crusade historian today believes those kinds of popular myths. Some of which I was even taught as an undergrad, right. So there's been a significant shift in the academic world about this because in light of recent scholarship. Same thing with the Inquisition. So again, part of the objective of writing these kinds of books is to help get that scholarly information out to people who won't take the time, like I will, to read, hundreds of pages of journals and academic journals and books and footnotes and endnotes and that kind of stuff. That's I hope that's what people get out of it. One way. So.
For sure. What do you think kind of caused this sort of defamation against these individuals and events in church history? Because I suppose it's like, oh, well, this is the popular narrative. What would have spurred people on into believing this in the first place? And what do you think? Who do you think the culprits are of introducing these things?
Yeah, great question. It's not, these false narratives don't come out of the vacuum, right? They don't just appear one day and say, oh, let's, somebody decides to pick an historical person and defame them, right. For their own edification, their own agenda. But so, no, actually, that's a great question. And I framed the book in terms of answering that question, right? So the book is broken into 4 different sections based on different groups throughout church history who have utilized church history or people or events in church history to attack the church in some way in their own day and age, right? And for different reasons. And so those, the framework is the 4 attacks are basically the Enlightenment attack, the Protestant attack, the secular attack, and then the last attack I call is quote unquote the Catholic attack, or people who call themselves Catholic in name, but really don't embrace the teachings of the church, or at least don't embrace many of the teachings of the church. And so they will either at best in this group, right, this attack, they'll at best either accept this false narrative and propagate it, or they will use it to try to discredit the papacy to make changes in the church that they want to see, right? So each of these areas of attack, right, these individuals in these groups, if you will, had different reasons for why they decided to disparage or malign or cancel various historical Catholic actors. We could take one, for example, the Enlightenment attack. The reason, the Enlightenment intellectuals back in the 17th, 18th centuries in Europe, especially in France and Britain, wanted to, I'm generalizing here, the Enlightenment, different groups within the Enlightenment, but generally speaking, they didn't like religion and they didn't like organized religion, let's say, and they didn't like specifically the Catholic Church's influence in politics and in education in their own day and age. And so as a way in which to try to lessen the church's influence in those areas, they looked back in time and history and created these false narratives about historical events and historical persons in order to gain control, really, of the institutions of higher learning in Europe, which they were able to do. So the Jesuits were suppressed in 1773 as a result of Enlightenment intellectual activity. And they, in particular, looked at the Middle Ages, the medieval period, and Spain, Catholic Spain also. And that's where we get a lot of the myths about the Spanish Inquisition, myths about the Crusades, about papacy in general, especially the papacy of Pope Pius IX, who might look at the book, all from these Enlightenment intellectuals who were trying to take over the universities of Europe, which they were successful and able in doing, And then they were able to craft these narratives and get them out into a wider area, into a wider knowledge base. And, many of these myths that they created then, we still believe and are still taught in our universities today, frankly.
Yeah. Yeah. So what would you say, maybe is one of the most egregious or, I guess, significant historical misrepresentations that you wrote about in this book?
Oh, geez. Great
Big question.
That's a big question. Well, I would think it's the ones we just talked about, definitely the Spanish Inquisition
Yeah.
and the Crusading movement. I also think, and this is one section I looked at in detail in the Protestant attack part of the book, is more English Catholic individuals, right? So in this part of the book and that part of the book, I look at Constantine, which is a whole different subject. But even more importantly, I look at Queen Mary Tudor, who's always known as Bloody Mary, even though that's, we can delve into that in more detail. That's really not accurate. But Mary Tudor is definitely maligned and canceled in our history, both secular and religious. And then Guy Fawkes as well, who most people might not necessarily know from the name, but they'll definitely know the caricature of the mask of his that many modern day anti-establishment, Antifa groups and others will have worn in their protests, taking it from the V for Vendetta movie back in 2006, right? So people might have known the image, they might not know the guy's name behind it and whatnot. So I talk about him in the book. And then also really, I think from perhaps the biggest person, if you will, who I write about in the book, who is much maligned and much canceled in history and who people really do not understand her true life story. That's Marie Antoinette. She is by far always known and seen by practically everyone you run into as being this, aloof monarch who, callously said, "Let them eat cake." Although spoiler, she never said that. Who still today even represents, right, this like what people picture as being the abject horror of monarchy and tyranny in society. Although she was very, very far from that in real life.
Right. Well, maybe we can take her story first. And obviously, we can't explain every single one of these. So you have to go to Catholic.com or Amazon, pick you up this book. But just to give you a little bit of a taste, I suppose, maybe we could look into her story. And first of all, maybe you could explain what the popular narrative is surrounding her life and that, I suppose, that scandal to many.
Yeah, sure. So, the popular version, if you will, or version of Marie Antoinette is that, that really comes from secularists, right? So she falls within the secular attack I put into the book. And so the secularists, even today, at the time when she was alive in the 18th century and even more today, were focused on political revolution, on changing the kind of geopolitical aspects of the world. And in her time, it was definitely an anti-monarchy kind of movement. And this kind of historical attack really grew in popularity in the 19th century, where in the middle part of the 19th century, you had significant political revolution throughout all of Europe. There were the rise of these new kind of political movements and ideologies, socialism, later on communism, Marxism, even democracy in a certain sense was new in many areas of Europe. And you have these monarchies changing and collapsing and being overthrown. And so in France, right, the common political narrative or historical narrative in today's world is that France, kind of followed the U.S., right, the American Revolution in terms of overthrowing monarchy, of establishing this so-called democratic form of government, but obviously the French Revolution, in the American mind, it was much more bloody, let's say, perhaps, than the American Revolution, at least in terms of non-combatants being involved. And so there's this general sense that, the French Revolution is kind of like our revolution here in the United States. And so, there's liberty, there's fraternity, there's equality, there's all these great things that happened. And they got rid of the monarchy because we as Americans know monarchy is bad, right? So, so we'll just leave that there. But then, so that's the general thought that most people have about the French Revolution. However, if you look at the French Revolution from a Catholic perspective, the French Revolution was horrifically destructive, not only for the country of France, the eldest daughter of the church, but also for Europe and the world in general, right? And so, the French citizens are still dealing with the impact of the French Revolution even today, several hundred years later, right? So, but the general narrative is it was great, it was wonderful. And, why it was great and wonderful was because you had this horrible tyrannical monarchy who just spent lavishly, the country's wealth and finances, and pushed and put the country into massive amounts of debt because of their lavish lifestyle. They were just rich and aloof and affluent and just didn't care if people died, and the poor didn't have food and these kinds of things. And so the nobility and the monarchy together, horrible, horrible things. That's the general consensus, right? So if you look at that a little more deeply, right, France was in political trouble and financial trouble in particular towards the end of the 19th century, or the 18th century rather, sorry. And the reason for that primarily was because the French helped these 13 colonies over here on the other side of the world break free from Great Britain, right? France entered the war. They indebted themselves severely into entering a war with Great Britain to help the United States, the fledgling United States. It's not, a far historical commentary to say that without French assistance, the American colonies probably would not have become independent. So we tend to forget that as Americans, but the French role was quite significant in our conflict there with Britain. But they put themselves in debt, and so as a result of that, there were many elements within French society that began to think that the one way they could solve that debt crisis was to get rid of the monarchy, which was seen as a drain on the treasury of the nation, but also get rid of the church, or at least lessen significantly the impact of the church in French society. And, frankly, historically speaking, there's some reasons for why that was explainable or justifiable. The church did own 10% of all land in France at the time of the French Revolution in 1789. It's a significant amount of land and some significant amount of wealth. And that's, again, accumulated over centuries, right? The church has been involved intimately in French society and life since, the end of the 5th century. So there's a lot of reasons for that. But anyways, these elements come to fore, and King Louis XVI is trying to deal with all of these different elements. And, King Louis was a good man. He was a faithful Catholic as well. He loved his wife, Marie. He loved his children. He loved his people. One of his major significant issues is that he just was not a good leader in terms of crisis. He didn't make decisions. He waffled. He vacillated. And he did like to indulge in all kinds of food and wine, and which is, it's very French in a certain sense,
right.
but he, and so he was a bigger man. So he kind of presented that ideal or, caricature of this aloof monarch who's just, a glutton who's, taking all the money of the country. And Marie, most people don't know, but Marie was obviously not French. She was Austrian by birth. And so her marriage to Louis was a politically arranged marriage to bring peace or solidify peace between France and the Austrian Empire at the time. And, Marie came to France as a teenager. She was 16 years old when she came to France. And she grew to love her adopted homeland, loved her adopted people greatly, loved Louis, was faithful to him, had, 4 children with him, 2 daughters, 2 sons. But when she was a younger woman, definitely at Versailles, she loved to party. She liked to spend money. She loved dresses and fashion. Her dresses were modest, by the way, but, she still liked to, have lots of dresses and fashion and clothes and jewels. And she loved diamonds. Who doesn't, right? So, and she had access to a lot of money to be able to procure these things. And so when she was younger, she gambled and, played cards and had lots of parties in Versailles. And so, but interesting and everybody thinks that and knows that about Marie Antoinette. Oh, she's this big party girl who spent all of France's money on these parties. Partially true when she was younger, but when she became a mother, and as she aged into her mid to late 20s and 30s, a lot of that decreased substantially, right? So she became much more mature, which is, the way it should work in life, right? I mean, when you get married, you have children, you might party a bit when you're younger, you have children, you settle down. That's the whole point.
You're
right?
too tired for that.
I mean, you're too tired for it. You don't have enough time to, the kids are crying all the time. But even if you're a monarch and have nursemaids and these kinds of things, it's a bit, right? So she did settle herself down, if you will, in a certain sense, but she loved her people. And as I mentioned, she never said the whole phrase, let them eat cake, which was never even attributed to her during the revolution, during her lifetime.
Really?
It wasn't even attributed really immediately after the revolution. That was a quote that was really brought about much later on in the later 19th century when there was a restoration of the French monarchy, or that was an idea that was going to happen. It did actually happen for a little bit of time, but that was a propaganda piece that was designed to try to prevent that from happening by certain elements within French society who didn't want to see a restoration of the monarchy in the 19th century. And so they painted this picture of, remember the last time we had monarchs, they were just aloof, they let people die, they didn't care, obviously exemplified by Marie Antoinette, who said this horrible thing, right, let them eat cake when they're starving. She never said it. Actually, the best historical source we have for who may have said something like that was Maria Theresa of Spain, who was the first wife of Louis XIV. And she died 72 years before Marie Antoinette was even born. So if anybody said it, may have been her in a callous kind of way. So there's some truth to, again, monarchy or a monarch saying something that callous, but it wasn't Marie. In fact, she did the opposite. When the people were starving in France during the revolution or right before the revolution, because of famine, because of financial problems, she did establish soup kitchens. She paid for it out of the royal treasury to feed the people of France, or Paris in particular. And so she had a great love for them, right? So that's why that comment or that quote attributed to her is so evil in a certain sense and diabolical really, is because it's the exact opposite of who she actually really was. But that's who everyone thinks she was, and it's not true at all. So, and sadly, she was then at the end of her life, when the revolution was successful in destroying the monarchy. They executed King Louis in January of 1793. Later that year in October, she was tried on whole kinds of horrible trumped up charges of sending funds from the French treasury to Austria, which she never did. Of even incest with her son, which was this horrific and horrible charge, which was not remotely true. But she suffered through that, and eventually she was found guilty and executed, right, by being guillotined in October of that year. And before she was guillotined, she wrote a beautiful letter to her sister, and basically from a Catholic approach, right, she wrote that she was sorry for all of the sins she had ever committed in her life. She forgave her executioners in just a beautiful, beautiful letter, which I quote in the book, between her and her sister, or that she wrote to her sister, rather, right before she was executed. So, this was a woman who was a deeply devoted woman of the church, loved France and her adopted homeland greatly, loved her husband, loved her children. And during her life, because of certain elements of French nobility who didn't like her because she was Austrian, she was horrifically propagandized and maligned during her lifetime. And sadly continues to be so even in history. So in my small part, I'm trying to overturn that horrible modern day narrative of who she was, because it's a caricature of who the actual woman was. She deserves better, frankly.
For sure. Yeah. And as Catholics and Christians more broadly, we ought to pursue the truth. That's just like the core of our religion, is the pursuit of truth. Christ says he is the way, the truth, and the life. And so the truth is something that we would see is life-giving and freeing in that sense of the word. Even not non-religious truths. Historical truths, scientific truths. They all, I suppose, they all glorify and honor God in their own particular fashion. And I know there are many non-Catholics, Protestants, even non-Christians who might use maybe not her story, but maybe even the story of, let's say, the Spanish Inquisition, or the fact of the Inquisitions more broadly, as an excuse to not be Catholic. Now, we're going to get into the specific details of the Inquisition here pretty soon. But what would you say to someone who just says, we can stand back, look at history, and say, yeah, these people did bad things. That doesn't automatically inauthenticate the Catholic faith, and I can prove the Catholic faith by these motives of credibility. And even though that bad thing happened, I don't need to go back justifying it or correcting it, because it doesn't even do anything to discredit the Catholic faith in general. What would you say to that approach?
Yeah, that's also a very good question. I address that in the kind of the conclusion of the book, in terms of how we as Catholics, let's say, how we should approach the subject of church history, and not only the individuals I cover in the book, but also these other events as well, which people use to discredit the church. So I say we have to really avoid two different responses, right? One response we have to avoid is being a kind of a whitewashing, triumphalistic panegyric, where everything was great in church history.
Right.
We don't have to, or try to always poo-poo people who bring up negative things, or there are bad popes or this or that.
Right.
No, we can't do that, right? Because as you point out, we have to embrace the truth of our past. We have to embrace the truth of the church and of these historical events and people, and we just have to be able to explain, again, historical context in which these events or people lived, and help to try to bring about a greater understanding of why these things happened, right? It's not, we don't embrace it, we don't say it was great or perfect. We can't walk away from it either, right? And the other response is to what I call is to avoid the ostrich approach, which is kind of what you just talked about, which was, oh, I don't need to really focus on that. Put our head in the sand and say, well, we don't really need to talk about the Inquisition, or we don't need to talk about the Crusades. We don't need to, it's all immaterial anyways, because it doesn't invalidate our doctrine or this or that. I mean, valid points to a certain extent, but it's a both and, right? As most things are in the church. We have to embrace our history. We have to understand it, explain it. And we can't just say pretend it didn't happen, because that doesn't lend credence, right, to our faith and to our church as a whole. It's a human institution, partially, right? It's a both and, right, as Lumen Gentium says. It's an institution made of both divine and human elements, and so we can't ignore the human element and the aspects of that human element that were both virtuous and not so, right, in church history. Yeah. So.
Yeah, for sure. And one of the marks of the church is holiness. And obviously, this has reference to the sacraments and to some miracles, prophecies that have sometimes accompanied holy men and women throughout the ages. But it can be a scandal to people who might hear of there were hundreds of thousands of people burned at the stake in the Inquisition, and it was such a horrible thing. Why would the church ever do that if the church was really founded by Christ and really had these sacraments that were efficacious and all these things? You would expect this to never be able to happen. And so it is very important that as Catholics, we don't all have to be historians. And like you said, we don't all have the time to, read through hundreds of pages of journal articles and other historical books. And that's why books like this, I feel, are so important. And, there are Hilaire Belloc is one I think influence on you, if I recall correctly, and some others who write, and I would say you write like this as well, who write history in such a way so as to not get all bogged down in the particulars, in some of the more mundane facts. Obviously, you might have to have some of that sometimes, but something I really respect and like about your works, not just this book, but other books. I mean, you pointed out the Glory of the Crusades. I have that book. It's a very well-written book. It's written in such a way that keeps you engaged and gives you the facts and gives you the particulars without, making it a laundry list of things. I need to remember this and that. It's connected, and I think it is a good and compelling way to present the history. And so I just wanted to thank you, first of all, for presenting it in that way. And for those of you who grew up like me, not enjoying history and who are wanting to get into history, this would be a good introduction into some of these topics. It's not, it's not a book that's hundreds of pages long on one subject. It's a good introductory thing. So I forget the point that I was making on that, but there are many people who, look at a history book and say, oh, I've seen a 600-page biography on, George Washington, and that looked so boring. So I'm never going to read any history book. Or they might recall some boring textbook in their high school or college career. This is not like that.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. And it's, when I give talks on church history, when I teach as well, I always like to bring up at the beginning when I talk about what is church history and why we should study it and how it's important. I do address, right, how most people have learned, or many people have learned history is from what I call the Calvin method. And most people think when I say the Calvin method, I'm saying John Calvin, but I'm not. I'm talking about Calvin and Hobbes, the comic strip. So back in the day, Bill Watterson had this great comic strip of Calvin where he's in school and he's taking a test. He's taking a history test. And his teacher asks him, when did the Pilgrims land at Plymouth Rock? And he writes the answer 1620, right? And then the next panel, he looks at the audience, right, breaks that fourth wall, whatever, and looks at us and says, or he writes a little note rather to his teacher under the answer and says, as you can see, I've memorized this utterly useless fact, and have, and now I intend to forget it forever, since I've passed the test question, basically.
Yeah.
And that's most people's understanding of history, is how it's been taught to them as names, dates, events, which are all important in history. But if we're not presented to us in a narrative perspective in a way that is engaging and that highlights the human drama that actually is history, right? And then you have good, you have evil, you have complex individuals that kind of maybe fall into those buckets, throughout their lives, if you will, just like we do, right? Everyone's a complex, fallen yet redeemed creature who sometimes, acts virtuously and sometimes doesn't. And that's compelling. It's engaging. And if we write history that way, which we should, it's not always written that way, but if we teach it and write it that way, then hopefully the lessons that we can learn from history, from studying these actions of men and women who have come before us, will resonate more with us and stay with us.
Yeah, and that's one of the motives for studying like the lives of the saints. The church constantly recommends that to us, is studying the lives of the saints, and that's not he was born in this day and did this thing on this day. It's not names and dates and arbitrary, not arbitrary, I suppose, but just kind of random sets of data. It is truly supposed to be presented to you in a way to make an impact and to be integrated in how you see the world. And that's one of the most important aspects of history that I'm starting to learn for myself as I read more about church history, medieval, patristic, everything in between, up into the modern times, right? So that is a major motivation, not only to know and defend the Catholic faith against those who might malign her and her children throughout the ages, but also just making an impact on your own life and how you see the world and how you interact with things around you. And so, yes, I'm very interested in getting into the Spanish Inquisition. Many people just call it the Inquisition. Is that not accurate? Is the Spanish Inquisition a subset of the Inquisition? Are all Inquisitions bad? Was the Spanish Inquisition bad? Where do we start here?
Yeah, there's how much time do we have? And no, I mean,
yeah, right.
It's a long,
however long you want to
conversation. However long we can go. Yeah, you could teach an entire academic class on the
right.
subject, and people do, right? So, the Inquisition, good point. So there's so many different misconceptions, right, concerning the so-called Inquisition or Inquisitors, the Spanish Inquisition, but there's a couple of different distinctions that I always like to bring out for people when we talk about that topic, right? So the first is from a historical perspective, is that what we call the Inquisition, or what we think of as the Spanish Inquisition, right, which is Monty Python famously said no one expects, or, you have Mel Brooks from the History of the World Part 1 and his little musical routine about the Inquisition, which is a catchy little song, but completely historically inaccurate in any way, in all ways, but funny. Is the distinction, the historical distinction, get back on the point, the historical distinction is that you have to kind of distinguish in your mind two different phases, if you will, of what is usually just called the Inquisition, right? And the two different phases, what I mean by that is that in the medieval period, so let's say starting at the early part of the 13th century, all the way up until, for about 100 years or so, until the 14th century-ish, 150 years, you had really what should be called in the period of the Inquisitors, right, or the medieval Inquisitors. There was no Inquisition, no institutional tribunal known as that during that period of time in church history. Rather, what you had was medieval papally appointed inquisitors, individual theologians, and trained men who would go into areas where there was heresy was suspected. And this really initiated in the south of France during what they so-called Albigensian or Cathari heresy in that region of the world at the time. And these men would go in, they were itinerant, so they didn't have a specific place where they stayed, and all these cases were brought to them, and they had this great institutional, bureaucracy and, this thought control police and organization that they ran. None of that happened during that period of time. They were itinerant, they went to individual cities or towns and villages, and they conducted for a period of time investigations into reported acts of heresy, right? And so, and that was designed by the church at that time in that period to, from the papacy, to be able to help to kind of take the area or the problem of heresy out of the realm of the secular world to a certain extent, right? So that, which lends me to the second point that I'll make here, and the second distinction we always have to keep in mind when we talk about these historical movements or these historical events known as the Inquisitors or Inquisition, is that at this time in church history and European history, heresy was not only an ecclesiastical or church crime, it was also a secular crime. It was against secular law, royal law in most kingdoms of Europe had, heresy laws. And that existed all the way up until the medieval or to the modern period, right? So there's two different legal jurisdictions involved in all of these historical situations when we talk about the Inquisitors or Inquisitions. There's the church legal system, the ecclesial legal system. There's also the royal or secular legal system. Now, within the secular, just one quick point on that, right, is that heresy was seen in the secular world as being a capital crime. It was against the kingdom, it was against the king, it was against the area of the territory, because heresy by people at the time was viewed as something that brought disunity to society, that brought violence, and history proves that out throughout periods. If you look back at all historical heretical movements, they always produce violence in some way or another. Sometimes that's violence by Orthodox people against the heretics, to be honest with you, right? And so,
Right.
in order to protect and safeguard as an act of charity to ensure that there was a proper legal process to review these cases, the church instituted these papal inquisitors to begin this charitable process of investigation. This is all coinciding with another interesting legal development in Europe at the time, where European legal systems begin to move from what was called accusatorial procedure to inquisitorial procedure. So previous to, let's say, the 12th century, the 11th, the 13th century, around that period of time, you had predominantly in European legal systems, different kingdoms, different areas, dukedoms, principalities. You had what was known as accusatorial procedure, which was the state or a authority, legal authority, did not investigate crime, right? Whether it was heresy, murder, this or that, there was no investigation, like we understand it from the police or district attorneys and these kinds of things. Didn't happen. Instead, if you were a victim or your family was a victim of a particular crime, you would go before the secular authority and you would accuse someone of committing a crime. I would go and say, Braden, stole my apples from my apple tree or something in my orchard, right? And I'd go to my local lord and I'd say, hey, this is what happened. And he would then allow you to come before him and tell your side of the story. So that it was the two of us accusing each other of what happened or what didn't happen. And then either the Lord would rule, or if you would take an oath to say I didn't do it, let's say, and let's say the Lord didn't believe you, or I didn't believe you, or I may continue to manifest, Braden is definitely guilty here. Then we could solve that by going to a trial by combat or any other kind of ordeal that you could undergo. You could say, I am absolutely innocent, and I, will undergo an ordeal. I'll walk through fire, or I'll, allow myself to be submerged in water for a period of time, or whatever, and see if I float. I mean, that's how, and people believed at the time that whatever happened as a result of that ordeal, that was God manifesting, the kind of verdict in this particular case, right? So if you walk through fire, you would be burned. Nobody thought then that you wouldn't be burned walking through fire. Some people think that today, like all these people are so stupid and no. They believe that if you did that or put your hand in fire, that, after a few days, if you began to heal, the burn began to heal, then that was a sign of your innocence. And if it didn't, and if it got worse or it became gangrenous or it just, you had to cut the hand off, it was getting infected, whatever, then that wasn't, you were guilty. So that was kind of how things worked up until about the 12th, 13th century. And then there was this change into inquisitorial procedure, which was then now what would happen is competent authority would investigate, and that would certain crimes, including heresy. And then if you were brought before the competent legal authority, whether secular or ecclesial, you would then be and you investigated. People would ask you questions. These inquisitors, right? They were trained to ask questions to see whether you believed, right, false teachings in the case of heresy. And then if you did, then they would tell you that, like, well, that's heretical. You can't believe that Jesus was not God, that he was just a creature, let's say. Or you can't believe that, all material things are bad and all spiritual things are good, like the Cathari did. And so then you would be given chances, at least in the ecclesial realm, to recant, repent, and to then be restored to communion after a period of penance, right? Some kind of penance we do. If you were obstinate in your denial of the basic doctrine of faith, no, I absolutely 100% believe that, all material things are evil, created by an evil God, and, the body is bad, and so therefore Jesus really wasn't incarnate, and all these things, you place your soul in danger and everybody else's soul that you talk to in danger as well. And so the ecclesial authorities will say, are you sure? Keep trying to give you opportunities to recant. If you refuse to do so, then they really couldn't do anything. They couldn't force you to believe, right, that what you're saying is not true. So they would then remand you to the secular authorities, and the secular authorities would conduct a trial. And if you were found guilty of heresy there, which was likely because you were already found guilty of heresy in the ecclesial court, then you would suffer the secular penalties of heresy, which was to be put to death. Right. So it was the secular authorities who actually executed people for heresy throughout Europe. It was not the church. It was against canon law to give the death penalty. That was not even an option, if you will. And no churchman, no cleric was supposed to be involved. Now, are there cases where, those laws weren't followed, those stipulations weren't followed in terms of clerics being present in executions? Yes, clerics never actually did the execution. It was a secular authority who did.
Right.
But, there were irregularities that did happen in historical circumstances. St. Joan of Arc in particular is one that really comes to mind. Right? So, But then, so fast forward from that, so that's a change, right? It's a huge, significant change in terms of how legal procedure worked. And so we have to understand that most people have no comprehension that that occurred, or that's what was happening here in Europe. And so that helps us to provide greater context to what was going on during that period. So fast forward now to the 15th century in Spain. You've had this period of medieval inquisitors in various areas of France, these papally appointed inquisitors throughout France and Europe. Now, when you go to Spain in the 15th century is a unique situation. You have the combining of the recent, relatively combining of the two kingdoms of Aragon and Castile with the marriage of King Fernando and Queen Isabel. You have in Spain a unique area of Christendom where you have multiple different peoples of different faiths, which really didn't exist in most areas of Christendom. You have a large concentration of Jewish people. You have a large concentration of Muslims. You have obviously Christians then as well. So when finally, in 1492, when Fernando and Isabel were able to liberate, if you will, the last Christian or the last Muslim occupied territory in Spain, in the south in Granada, and take that over and finally, kind of bring to conclusion the Reconquista, it's called, in Spain, then they begin to have some concerns about many people in Spain who are recent converts to the faith. So these are Jewish people, Muslim people who converted to the Catholic faith, but are recent converts. And they're known as conversos. And so in Spain, many of them become, through the period of time, they become very, influential in Spanish society. They take on all kinds of interesting and important jobs in the church and the secular world as well. And so there is a group in Spain known as the Old Christians. These are people who, can trace their Christian lineage for centuries in Spain. Many of them get jealous and they get, concerned and they get, not happy, again, jealous that many of these conversos have risen to power, positions of power and authority. And so then there's this kind of growing element, conspiracy theory within Spanish society at the time that, well, maybe these people really aren't Christian. Maybe they're saying publicly that they're Christian, but in private, they still do, Jewish things, or they believe the Jewish faith, or they still do Muslim things and believe the Muslim faith. So how do we really know that they're a Christian? How do we know that they're not going to open the gates of the city when a Muslim invading army comes to the shores again, right? There's a very real, idea and threat in Spanish society at the time, right? Built up over centuries. Now, historians have shown and proven that the vast majority of conversos were people who did convert for authentic reasons. That they did convert to become Christian, but there was this kind of, they weren't real catechized, to be honest with you. And so many of them didn't know, for example, that, I can still do work on the Sabbath. I can do work on Friday or whatever, or on Saturday. And so Friday night and Saturday. So many of them continue to, practice many of these kind of non-doctrinal customs from their Jewish and Christian and Muslim faith, so they wouldn't eat pork or these kinds of things, right? Not out of any kind of I'm still a Muslim or I'm still a Jew, but just because that's customarily what their family had done.
Right.
All of that leads to then this kind of situation in Spain where you have these conspiracy theorists, these old Christians who go to the king and queen and basically say, look, we have this significant converso problem. Some preachers even believe this too. Some church officials, priests believe this kind of idea and theory as well, began to preach about it. And so that prompted the monarchy to go to the Pope and ask him to grant them the authority to establish an institution known as the Inquisition, which was a royal organization, a royal instrument of in Spain, to investigate heresy in Spain and to investigate these conversos. And so that was granted. Sixtus IV granted that to King Fernando and Queen Isabel, and thus begins the so-called Spanish Inquisition.
That seems like a major distinction between these itinerant inquisitors, established by the Pope, theologians and things such like that. And you said it was a secular court that the Pope granted. He granted them the ability to do that, but it was under their authority, if I'm understanding correctly.
That's correct. I mean, it was an ecclesial court, so it was run by clerics, but it was governed in Spain by the Queen and King, right? So it's a royal instrument of power and authority, if you will.
Right.
And so the Pope, the Pope really didn't have any authority over the Spanish inquisitors. I mean, he kind of nominally did in terms of that they were clerics, And when reports came to him later on that there were some issues and some abuses going on in the Inquisition in Spain, he actually wrote a letter to the king and say, basically he's saying, I'm paraphrasing, but saying, hey, look, I've heard reports of things not going well in Spain with these inquisitors.
Right.
What's going on? This isn't appropriate. And King Fernando famously wrote him back a letter that said, you gave me authority to run this in Spain, so I don't know why you're writing me this letter. Right, basically, again, paraphrasing the king, but
Right.
mind your own business, Pope. This is my kingdom. I'm doing this. You gave me authority to do it, and so it really was an organ of. And the Spanish Inquisition lasted for many, many centuries in Spain. I mean, it wasn't officially abolished until the 19th century. It went through many different phases in its life.
Right.
So the first phase is what most people think about, which was from the 15th century into the early part of the 16th century, and it was really focused on these conversos. Many myths and misunderstanding and conceptions associated with it. It was not this overarching, omniscient, omnipotent organization that controlled every aspect of Spanish society or Spanish life. Even these were urban environments where the institution was established in certain Spanish cities. So it wasn't throughout the countryside. One historian has estimated that 95% of the Spanish population during this period of time never had any dealings with the Inquisition. Maybe knew about it, but had no dealings whatsoever because most of Spain was still rural and agrarian at that time. People weren't living in cities. Right. But those who lived in cities had to deal with it to a certain extent. And, there was all kinds of procedures put in place concerning how it was to operate, concerning torture, concerning, what kinds of punishments and sentences were given out and whatnot. So what most people believe about the Spanish Inquisition has been grossly mischaracterized, by modern day propagandists and others, again, to discredit the church. So,
right. So it sounds like the crown, I suppose, had a lot of say as to who were put in these positions of power and what sort of things that they could do. If I recall correctly, there was one position, was it like the Grand Inquisitor, the person who was over the main, court? Wasn't he established by the Pope? Is that right?
So, so you have in Spain, the way it was organized is you had the Suprema, which was a council of people appointed to oversee the Inquisition in Spain by the king. So it was a royal appointment, but there were clerics that were appointed to it. So the Grand Inquisitor, if you will, the Inquisitor General, the first one, or one of the most important ones, was Tomás de Torquemada, which I talk about in the book. And so he's the one who actually comes up with a lot of the procedures. He changes many of the procedures that the Inquisitors had used before he comes to that position of authority and power, to make it more charitable, to more just, to be more lenient in their sentencing and whatnot. So it's, again, complete opposite of the caricature most people think of him, that he was a sadistic, torturer who went around and just loved to round up Spanish people for, the sake of just rounding them up and whatever. It was somebody who was appointed by the king, but the Inquisitor General was always a cleric and someone who was a theologian and at least trained in understanding the intricacies of theology, and usually lawyer, usually had canon law and even in secular law background as well. Right.
So I get the impression that these weren't bloodthirsty assassins who were sneaking around trying to catch people in their heresy, and the moment they heard something that didn't align with what they thought was right, they took them to the torture chambers and made them believe the right things. That's not right, is it?
No, that's not right. Yeah, not at all. I mean, it's again, the Inquisition in Spain, just like the medieval inquisitors, followed a very strict procedures. All of these sessions are recorded. There's vast amounts of historical documentation and manuscripts on these, transcripts that you can go and look at. And many historians have done that and translated these and provided the documents in translation so we can use them. So no, I mean, that wasn't what the purpose of the Inquisition was. Actually, the purpose of the Inquisition, again, was to be, it was a charitable way in which the church could help people understand. In many cases, they weren't aware or they didn't really fully understand that they were embracing heretical teachings. And so provided opportunities for them to, again, recant and rejoin communion with the church. And if they were obstinate, again, they would be remanded to the secular authorities. One of the big things people talk about is torture, and then, one of many different rules, regulations, restrictions placed around the use of torture. It was common in European legal systems at the time. So I think that's another thing that people misunderstand or the distinction they don't recognize, that This wasn't something unique to the ecclesial court or something unique to inquisitors. They weren't the ones who invented it. It was done in secular courts, much more so than in Spanish inquisitorial courts. And it was governed by a certain set of structures, right, and regulations. So the torture session couldn't last, indefinitely. It could only last for a certain period of time. And it was usually, 15 to 30 minutes, depending on that. It can only be done once. Like, you couldn't torture somebody, consecutively or throughout the entire proceeding. It was just a one-off thing. Although, to be fair and to be truthful about it, there were ways in which inquisitors kind of found around that. You could suspend a torture session, not consider it closed, to suspend it and then restart it again later and say you're not really torturing the person a second time. You're just restarting the first session, right? So, I mean, that was a loophole that eventually had to be closed, and it was. But in many cases, in many organizations and bureaucracies, people will find ways around the regulations to get to do what they want. Sadly, it's human nature. We still do it today.
Right.
So, that was problematic. But again, once that was discovered, these things were put in check, or things were put in check to stop that. Certain people were free from being tortured. If you were pregnant, right? Pregnant women wouldn't be tortured. Children, older people, thankfully, university professors couldn't be tortured. I like that. That was a great rule. And other things, right? So that was important and helpful. You also, the torture was never done by a cleric, right? So again, no monk, no theologian, no priest could engage in actually torturing someone. It was the secular authorities who administered the torture. Again, the torture was designed so that you could not draw blood. So it wasn't a form of punishment either. It was always designed to elicit a confession, which was necessary for the inquisitors to be able to then pass judgment on someone, right? As part of inquisitorial procedure, that switch from accusatorial to inquisitorial, one needed to confess that they had committed the crime, if you will, right? And so torture was one tool in the toolbox that inquisitors could use or could not use. And most of them did not like to use it, frankly. It was not as common as people think. Most inquisitors did not find it useful or helpful because, again, as we would say and know with kind of common sense, people will say a lot of things when they're being physically hurt, and may not say the truth. They may just say something to get the torture to stop. So it wasn't a very effective method, and they didn't use it. And in fact, just another data point that I think is quite interesting about this, that sheds a different light on the Inquisition than people think about, is that we have recorded cases in Spain in particular where people were arrested for secular crimes, put into secular jails. And while they were in a secular jail, they would then say something blasphemous or spout something heretical to their secular jailers, so that they would then be remanded to the Inquisition, to the church, so that the Inquisition had its own separate jail and holding cells, where people were placed while they were going through the procedure. So they were remanded then, they were taken out of the secular jail and put into the ecclesial jail, because the ecclesial jails, the church jails, were much more humane and much less severe than secular prisons. So these people didn't believe the heresy. They just said it to be able to get out of it and to go to be... Because heresy trumped all kinds of, or any kind of accusation of heresy trumped all secular crime.
Right.
So you would then go to the church and go through that procedure first before then you could go back to the secular court. So that just gives you an idea that, this was not some kind of horrible, tribunal of monks. It's just bloodthirsty and sadistic and, whipping people and beating people on the thousands just because. If you actually had people wanting to go to those prisons because they were better than the secular prison, that should give us pause to think, kind of rethink what we normally associate with this historical event.
Yeah, for sure. And you go into so much detail about the process, the whole process from being accused and asking the questions, and they go to jail and all these things, await the trial, and these rare cases when torture was used, it was well regulated, especially in comparison to the secular counterparts. I found one detail I found interesting was that these torture sessions actually had to be documented by someone who was there watching and listening to everything that was going on. And so it seems like the popular notion that, these people were trying to torture them to compel them to believe X, Y, and Z that they didn't actually believe. It seems like these less than efficient ways of eliciting a confession were used for just that, just eliciting a confession from the individual who is suspected of the crime, right? And you also mentioned in the book that it was because it was inefficient, it was later on removed from the arsenal, so to say. So I found that very interesting. Right. And for those of you who are more interested, again, in reading about this, pick up this book. I'm afraid we're about out of time for today, but there is a few more questions that I'd like to ask you specifically. Sure. Besides Steve Weidenkopf, what historian would you suggest our audience to look into? Is there a historian that has made a major impact on you that you enjoy reading specifically for like Catholic apologetics, Catholic history, church history?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few. So, at least from a Catholic historical perspective, definitely recommend the works of Dr. Warren Carroll. So he's the founder of Christendom College, where I teach. So he wrote a 5 or 6 volume History of Christendom series. Wow. Now, I would caveat that, love Dr. Carroll, love his work, but at the end of the day, these are very dense, books. So he writes from a narrative perspective, so it's very engaging and very interesting. But they're like 500-600 pages a piece, right, with extensive footnotes. So
keep that in mind.
Caveat, right?
Yeah.
Keep that in mind. But I encourage you, right? And he does have. If you go to the college's website, I think it's just go to Christendom Press. Just type that into Google. Our press sells also kind of more condensed versions of his book. So he has a book just on Isabel, Queen of Isabel of Spain. He has a book on the Spanish Civil War. Other topics like that. So there's smaller volumes you can get. So maybe start with those before you delve into the history of Christendom, unless you're a huge historical nerd or something like that, which is great. You should be. Everybody should love that and check out those footnotes. So, I mean, he's very good. Hilar Belloc has written. Hilar Belloc is, he's a little controversial in some areas, at least especially among certain academics. But you have to understand why he was writing, right? He's writing at a time when he's trying to overturn the predominant wing English interpretation of history when he's living in the early 20th century. So his writing is really geared in that perspective. But I think there's many things you can learn from Belloc by writing his works. And most of his stuff has been obviously republished and still available today. And for the rest of it, those are kind of general historians. I mean, from the rest of it kind of depends on time periods. I get to ask this question a lot, like what historian or what general history do you recommend? It's kind of a hard question to answer, to be honest with you, because there really isn't, the way we do history is you look at different periods or different times or different persons. And so if you want to neck down into a specific subject, then there are all slew of different, specialists that you can read that are fantastic and great. But it really depends upon what period of history you're interested in, rather than just kind of a general history. I have written one summary kind of overview book, if you will, a general narrative of church history called Timeless, History of the Catholic Church. So if people are interested in that, they can get that. I go from Pentecost to modern day, and it's 500 pages, so it's big. It's broken down into bite-sized chunks for people, and it's really kind of a summary narrative format. But it depends on your time period.
Right. So this will be the last question. I don't want to keep you for too long. What is your favorite either time period or maybe series of events from church history to read about
for me,
or write about?
Yeah. Oh, that's easy. I mean, for me, it's the crusading movement, so the medieval period of time in particular, right? So usually, from the time period of 1000 to about 1400. It's really kind of my sweet spot. That's where I really will read anything in that time period and love that time period. So there's all kinds of fantastic crusade historians that specialize that are more than just medievalists. They're really just crusade historians. So people like Jonathan Riley Smith, Christopher Tyerman, Marcus Bull, other people like that are really, really good. Jonathan Phillips is also fantastic. He's written a number of different books. Madden as well. I'm drawing a blank on his first name. I always want to say it's John Madden, but it's not, because that's the football guy. But Thomas Madden, I knew it would come to me. So Thomas Madden has written several books, especially in a very, very good book on the Fourth Crusade, if people are interested in that. But that or anything medieval. So really love medieval France and the time period of King St. Louis IX in the 13th century. Find his life fascinating in that whole period of time as well. So.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. I'm sure our audience will very much enjoy this interview. And if you want more, make sure again to go pick up Canceled from either shop.catholic.com or Amazon or wherever you buy books. I don't know if there's any other place people buy books like that. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoy this video. Make sure to leave a thumbs up. Comment down below if you have any questions, comments, concerns, or suggestions for interview books, interview authors next time. And as always, I hope that by our learning the faith, your faith will be strengthened as well. You have an amazing day, and we'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.